Well, good morning. It is good to see everybody. My name is Ryan. My pronouns are he, him. I am white, cisgendered, male, heterosexual, born citizen of the United States, which means I hit the privilege jackpot. And part of that means that as a follower of Jesus in my everyday normal life, I seek to follow the one who's written about in the letter of the Philippians, who, even though considered to be God, set aside all that privilege to walk among us. And so part of my spirituality, part of who I am as a pastor, part of our church is to recognize those spaces of privilege, to recognize how we, people such as myself, have benefited tremendously from racist policies and foundations and ways in which the Christian faith has been used to facilitate the oppression of others and to create a space that is welcoming for all, that honors the hurt and the pain and says, let's come together and seek justice and righteousness and let it flow like a mighty river, which feels very much like the Jesus of history. And so that's where you are today. If you are a guest, it's important that you know that right away, because I understand that our building can look like other churches that may sound a little different. And so we're grateful that you're here. It was wonderful to meet some of you who this maybe was your first or second time. I actually met a couple here today who last week was their first time and they came back. So they win. They win. I did get some emails of people that weren't coming back after their first time, but you know, it's all good. So it is really good to be together. If you're tuning in online, if you're listening to this on demand, thank you so very much. So this morning we just opened up with a song called Counting Blue Cars. How many of you have ever heard that song before? Counting Blue Cars, yes. And if you listened closely, and even if you didn't listen too closely, there's a line in that song that always makes people kind of sit up. Tell me all your thoughts on God, because I'd really like to meet her. And if you'll notice, every other song that we sang so far this morning that talked about God used male pronouns, him. Let's just close in prayer. Let's call it a day, because you all ask hard questions, okay? Right? Now, for some of us, that line, might have felt a little refreshing, maybe even healing. Like someone finally said out loud, wrote a song that we've wondered in our hearts for a long time. But then there's others maybe that it might have felt a little jarring, if we're honest, maybe uncomfortable. Her? Did they just call God her? I can remember I was here at Crossroads I felt like a minute, and I was, after one of the services, I was standing right over here, and there were some people that just made a beat. I mean, they had a purpose. They were coming up to me, and it was not a good purpose, I've been in this game long enough. I know where there's a good purpose, and I know where there's nefarious purposes in the walk towards me. And they came up, and I had, during that talk at some point in time, as I am prone to do, is I will say something to the effect of, whatever words you like, whatever makes sense for you, whatever, if you think about it in terms of God, the universe, he, him, her, they, whichever word. And they really struggled with that. It was really hard for them. And they, expressed that opinion that God was him. It had to be. And it was an interesting conversation. And that tension right there, right? That mixture that some of us in the room are like, finally, we're getting it right. And some of are like, what is going on? We're going to sit in that tension for a little while today because you all asked for it. I mean, I've actually, the email I got this past week, I thought about forwarding it on to the person who actually asked the question and say, take it up with this person. I don't know, right? But you've asked for it. So the question today is this idea of, what about the divine feminine? Right? Why do we neglect the idea, or why do we have such a hard time when we speak in feminine ways? And feminine is a cultural reality, but when we use kind of feminine language, what might be attributed as feminine culturally, right? Why do we have such a problem with that? How come we don't ever talk about that? And it's a great question. And the truth is, many within the Christian tradition struggle with referring to God using feminine pronouns or feminine language. How many of us in the room, raise your hand up nice and high, grew up in a religious setting, if you grew up in a religious setting, and it was always he, him pronouns? Raise your hand up nice and high. Right? So when you hear that over and over again, it kind of gets ingrained in us, right? And part of the struggle with why it's so difficult when we hear a female pronoun used to describe God or things like that, part of the struggle is, first, we confuse, right, male and female biology, right, male and female sex labels, we confuse that with masculine and feminine, which are cultural expressions. Right, so for simplicity's sake, and it is a very simple, like we could spend days talking about this in the conversations that's happening among science and religion and faith and all these things, but if we could just recognize, like, let's start with this idea that male and female are biological categories, and it's a binary that is very questionable given the realities that we know take place in the science world and in life, but it's a biological category. But the idea of masculine and feminine, these are expressions of culture. These are ways of being, behaving, dressing, existing in the world that are imposed through cultural normativity, right? And I always love it when I get to say normativity, right? In other words, like, we're told that if you are a certain biological sex, you're supposed to act this way, dress this way, do these things. And culture imposes that on you. And it is different depending upon the culture you grew up in, right? Like, and so gender is what some scholars will refer to as performative, right? That we actually perform gender, and in performing it, we create it, and we perpetuate it, but we can also disrupt it in the performance of it. And so we oftentimes confuse this idea of biological versus cultural expressions. And I would suggest that I can't say this as fact, so I can't say the fact is, but I can say our tradition holds, and most traditions, many traditions, I shouldn't even say most, but many traditions, many of the monotheistic traditions would hold that God is not bound by biology. Okay? So the divine doesn't have chromosomes or hormones, but still, even though, like, across history, God has been overwhelmingly described in these masculine terms. He, him, father, king, Lord, warrior, these very masculine identities. And the truth is, those words that we get handed, they shape our imagination about the divine. And make no mistake about it, whenever we consider the divine, we're using our imaginations, okay? We're filling in the blanks. And because that's the language that we're handed, it eventually gets hardened into this assumption that God is male. And you could probably have conversations, and I might even be having some conversations with you all, that this may be the first time that you're actually being challenged to think through that assumption, that God is a man, that God is male biologically. And it's interesting, given that our tradition really kind of holds that God is spirit, right? And that we would say God supersedes biology, it's really telling that one of the realities of human history is that every culture has like thought about the divine in both masculine and feminine dimensions, though. So we hold on one hand, like, of course we use he, him, and it's the king and warrior and all these things. But yet, if you study culture and you study faiths, like, there is always the description of the divine in both masculine and feminine dimensions, some way or another. Like in the Egyptians, like, they saw Isis as the mother of life. The Mesopotamians worshipped Ishanan and Ishtar, and they saw these as two powerful female forces of fertility, love, and even war. The Greeks honored both goddesses and gods as they imagined how the world works. And so I say that to recognize that all of religion in some way, shape, or form, and I use the word religion in kind of a narrow sense, but like anytime we start grappling with this idea of the divine or the metaphysical, like, humanity has always intuited that, like, the fullness of it all requires both. And some of you are sitting there and you're going, yeah, but I've read my Bible. I've read my Bible, Ryan, and sometimes I wonder if you have. Yeah, I really do. I wonder if all those degrees are just lies. And you've actually called my institutions of higher learning and you've asked for the transcripts because you didn't believe. You doubted me. And you said, but Ryan, I've read my Bible, and the Israelites, come on. No, didn't happen. Didn't happen. Like, they were strict monotheists. Yahweh, their name for the deity, which, by the way, means I will be what I will be. You can put that in your pipe and smoke it, but at any rate, says That was me being mean, okay? I'm sorry. Shouldn't have. I'm a peacemaker. But you say, well, Ryan, I've read it. I've done the 1-year Bible multiple years. That's what happens if you want to go to heaven. You got to read the whole thing. And you said, there's nothing in there. And I would say to you, oh, no, you're wrong. Israel was no different. Ancient Israel was no different. Like our archaeological finds that they show us that many Israelites worshipped Asherah. How many of you have heard of the lovely worship of Asherah? Anybody in the room? Some of you have. I would expect nothing less from you too. Right? And the reality is they often understood Asherah was probably the adaptation of another ancient Near Eastern goddess who became known in much of Israelite thinking as Yahweh's girlfriend, Yahweh's wife. In archaeological digs, we found what are called Asherah poles or pillars set up, and they show that many of these Israelites worshiped Asherah right alongside Yahweh. And these pillars say blessed, like there's been inscriptions on them, and they say blessed be you by Yahweh and his Asherah. Like the archaeology shows that ancient Israelite, right, as much as the writers of the Hebrew Bible want us to imagine them as strictly monotheist, they were like everybody else, just trying to figure it out. And when you think about it, it's pretty smart, right? If life isn't going well and you're not worshiping the God's wife, you got to ask yourself, maybe he's mad because we haven't been paying enough attention to the misses. Deeply sexist way of saying that, right? I just want you to say that. I just want to say that out loud. I recognize it. But like that was the mentality. Yahweh's mad at us because we aren't worshiping Asherah. Of course. We're not taking it, so we got to do that. And so in the earliest centuries of Israel's development, right, we see people were very comfortable imagining Yahweh not alone, right? Imagining that there was something missing, and that Yahweh, their God, the way in which they identified Yahweh, needed the feminine alongside. But what happened to that idea? Like, where did that go? Like, how come we don't read more about that? How come we don't have worship songs today to Yahweh and Asherah? Both of them. Like, how come we don't have prayers within Judaism to Asherah? Like, what happened? How was Asherah written out of the tradition? Well, part of it was the prophetic passion for monotheism, right? And that's great, wonderful, I get it. I'm a big believer that God is one, okay? So I'm down with that. But part of the reason why we lost that imagery and why it doesn't make it into the text as explicitly is because you have a group of people writing the text from a position of what? Power and privilege. Yes, y'all are catching on. It's only been 6 years, but you're going to get it. Like, power has a lot to do with when things get written down, right? And it was no different then. And so here's the thing, like the prophetic voice was very concerned, not about God's gender, right? But they were concerned with God's oneness. And so the worship of Baal, you've probably maybe heard about that if you went to Sunday school, the worship of Asherah and other deities that certainly filtered their way into the everyday normal life of Israelites, especially those that lived outside of Jerusalem in the more rural parts of the area, right? Those became a threat to Israel's identity according to those in charge. Now, I know this is really strange and really hard to imagine that a multiplicity of identities could threaten cultural uniformity. We don't experience any public policy taking place right now to try and, seek to end the diversity of what Americans look like or anything like that. I know that that's very hard for us to imagine, okay? But imagine that there are people in charge in a galaxy far, far away that wanted uniformity. They wanted everyone to believe the same way, worship the same way, and they wanted all those people to do it in one location because economically that made a lot of sense for them, okay? So all that's in the background of the beauty of our text and our scriptures, right? And so what the prophets were doing, right, in some sense, right, and the writers of some of these books, they're like pushing back against things that could dilute that uniformity. Right? And so they're pushing back against hierarchy and multiplicity and divided loyalties within the nation. And in the process of insisting that Yahweh, their God, was one, that there was no need to worship anyone else, anything else, something else happened. And that was that the feminine portion of the divine, that which we imagine and which our hearts kind of long for, was erased. And so we might say, well, it was misguided to think about two gods, Asherah and Yahweh. We might contend that that's a fair conversation to have. But what that misguidedness captured was the fullness, right, of the divine, was the fullness of all creation, right, was that broad spectrum of gender. And really we do have to continually ask, well, who gained from this erasure? Who gained from the erasure of the feminine? Well, patriarchy did. We're getting all the words today. I just want everybody to know I am getting on a plane as soon as we end this service. Like, I literally have to race down, and I am not going to check my email for the next 3 days, all right? So take your time writing the response if you want to, all right? So patriarchy wins, right? Patriarchy gains. Men, not men like all humanity, men consolidated religious authority into temples and in households, and they claimed this divine backing for their dominance. Patriarchy gained. An empire gained. A masculine god as king image was used all over the place to justify human kingship and conquest and militarization. Like, these are the big winners. And you know who lost? This is not a trick question on the exam, okay? First of all, who lost? Women. Yeah, women said that. The men were like, I have to tie my shoes. I don't know. I can't imagine who lost in that deal. What's for dinner? I don't, oh man. Let's keep our promises. What is happening here? I shouldn't have made that joke. I recognize that now, but like women. Women were the big losers in that one. Children. Not just women, but children. The vulnerable. Like all of those people, right, whose experience ultimately of the divine as mother, nurturer, midwife, comforter, were pushed to the margins. And this narrowing of imagination has done real, tangible harm. This is not theoretical. Real, tangible harm. Now, you think about what I just said about who was pushed to the margins by this, and then if you're familiar with the person of Jesus, like historically speaking, and even the Jesus of faith, but if you're familiar with this work, like, who is it that was deeply attracted to Jesus? Right? Like, all the people that were the victims of this movement of the erasure of the divine feminine in the experience, right? So when the feminine is pushed out of our theology, meaning our way of imagining and thinking about God and understanding God, it becomes easier and maybe even necessary to push out women from leadership. I don't know if you know that or not, but that's happened in religion in a few parts and places, We push women out, silence their voices. It becomes very easy. And to make this incredibly sexist assumption that God's authority, that God's voice, that God's wisdom, whatever words you want to use, can only flow through male bodies. And when I say that out loud, I hope that there's something in all of us that we might not fully get it, but there's something about it that is ridiculous. That there's something about it that we would honor as absolutely absurd, that male genitalia are the key to God working in the world. I'm going to let that one sink in. Like, when I say it like that, is there something inside of you that's like, yeah, maybe we should think about that one? And so the loss of this feminine image of God, it has shaped our societies to be places that privilege domination over nurture, to be societies that privilege hierarchy over relationship and power over compassion. And that's what happens. See, when the divine is erased, when the feminine divine is erased, patriarchy and empire, they gain all the power while women and the vulnerable are silenced. And we might not recognize that what's happening explicitly in Jesus' ministry is a work against those things right? Because Jesus doesn't ever stand up, and we don't have any record of Jesus like, blessed are those that fight patriarchy, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Instead, we have Jesus saying, blessed are those who are the victims of patriarchy, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. And we have to do some thinking, which I know is not religion's strong suit. Religion's strong suit is control. I get it. I'm telling you, from my viewpoint, it's not a bad gig. But what Jesus does is he's going after all the outcomes of these things. But here's the beautiful grace about our tradition, right? That our scriptures, the Christian scriptures themselves, refuse to be completely complicit in it. Like, even in the midst of power writing it, even as masculine metaphors dominate the pages of our scripture, feminine images of God are still woven throughout the biblical texts. And they're like these little Teflon threads that refuse to be cut out. They're just super resilient, right? And we should expect that texts that are written about the divine feminine, that give us an image of God in feminine language, is resilient and is strong, and it withstands the desire and the design of those in power to erase. Our scriptures, the Christian scriptures, they do testify that no matter how much history tries to silence the feminine, God's self-revelation is more expansive than patriarchy. And that's amazing. And we find this wisdom in Scripture. Very quickly, we see God as the divine mystery that brings comfort of a mother. The comfort of a mother. Isaiah 66:13, the prophet says, as a mother comforts her child, so I, Yahweh, will comfort you. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem. Right? These closing chapters of Isaiah are powerful, and they are a vision of restoration of the nation after a season of exile. Israel has suffered displacement. They've suffered despair. And their God is promising not only to return them to the land, but to console them like a mother holding her child. Not the iron fist of empire, but the soothing embrace of a parent who gathers. We also see passages where the divine mystery struggles as one giving birth. For those of you that have given birth, can I get an amen? Right? There's that struggle. Isaiah 42, verse 14, the voice of the prophet again, speaking on behalf of God, says, for a long time I have held my peace. I have kept still and restrained myself, but now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. Can I just say, in my life, I've never, ever come across a physical male human being who came to me and said, man, I am just struggling like I'm giving birth. It's never happened. I've never heard a man use that metaphor to describe their angst and their anguish. But here you have the God of Israel, defined as Yahweh, always depicted in masculine terms, saying, I am struggling with you all like I'm in labor. And God compares that divine activity, right, to childbirth. Painful and raw, but bursting with new life and new vision. And redemption here is not a military conquest. It's the travail of bringing forth something entirely new, of giving birth. God's power is expressed in labor pains. Not the sword, not a war horse, but labor pains. And I know some of you are saying this. You're like, Ryan, I'm going to go back to this. I have read my Bible. And that's all OT. I'm an NT person. That's all Old Testament stuff. I'm a Jesus person, right? I'm a New Testament. And Jesus was a man. And I believe that Jesus was God in the flesh, so God must be a man. Well, okay, let's talk about that for a second. Jesus, right, who our tradition says this is our divine incarnation. Our tradition says if you want to know what God is like, look to Jesus. That's what the Christian tradition says. If you want to know how God acts or thinks or moves, whatever, we look to Jesus. Well, Jesus, the divine mystery incarnate, longed to be like a mother hen. Like one of the most famous things that Jesus ever does in his story is he looks out over Jerusalem. And we have it in Matthew 23 and in Luke 13. And he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that killed the prophets and stones those who were sent to it. How often I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. In this beautiful lament over Jerusalem, Jesus does not call himself a lion. I wanted to gather you like my pride, and I was going to roar over and I'll no. He doesn't say, as a king gathers all their loyal subjects. He uses the image of a mother hen. And I want to tell you, I think a hen can be kind of nasty at times. But there's a vulnerability to that. There's an ordinariness to it. The hen, yet that hen can be very protective. A hen will shield her chicks with her own body, taking on the danger herself. And Jesus embodies that like sacrificial maternal instinct when? On the cross. As full as you could get. So like even Jesus would embrace that. We have pictures of the divine mystery that transcend both the Hebrew scriptures, or what we pejoratively call the Old Testament, unintentionally, I get it, but we do, and the New Testament, right? And that there's this concept that the divine mystery is wisdom personified as a woman present at creation. We see this in Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8 says, does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. And I know that this verse is filled with male pronouns, but we have wisdom, Sophia, personified as a woman, present at creation, woven into the very fabric of the world. And then John's gospel talks about this wisdom, this divine logos in Greek terms, and is identified as the Christ, the universal Christ, present at creation. See, the early church, they made a direct connection with this. They connected the divine logos, a concept that flew out of some of Greek philosophy and Greek mythology, and they connected it to the divine wisdom that was present at creation. And so this feminine Sophia becomes the universal Christ figure. And that means that femininity is built into the very understanding of Jesus. If Jesus is the manifestation of the universal Christ, then built into that very fabric is the femininity of wisdom, of Sophia. The divine mystery is described as a nurturing parent. In Hosea chapter 11, it says, yet it was I who taught Ephraim was one of the tribes of Israel, to walk. I took them up in my arms. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. Here, God is pictured as teaching a toddler to walk, picking them up when they fall, lifting them to their cheek, feeding them. This isn't abstract theology. It is daily mothering, this daily image. God stoops down, tends to us like a parent, caring for a little one. And these images, from Isaiah's mother to the laboring woman, to Jesus, the hen, the incarnation of wisdom, Sophia, to Hosea's nurturing parent, the Bible is full of feminine imagery. Father Richard Rohr, a Franciscan monk, once said this. I love it. He said, Jesus was a feminine soul in a masculine body. Jesus was a feminine soul in a masculine, and by that I think he meant that the qualities often dismissed as feminine, right? Those qualities of compassion and tenderness and vulnerability that are often ascribed to feminine being, right? That those things were central to Jesus' life and ministry. They were central to that. So it's not that feminine images of God aren't in our tradition. They're there. They've always been there. We just haven't always paid attention. So the heart of the answer to the question, the heart of today's talk is this. The divine, right? The divine is not genderless, but genderful. And when we bring that imagination to God, the world opens up. In John's gospel, Jesus is having a conversation, and he says that God is spirit, and those who worship him, I get the problem, worship in spirit and truth. But the foundation is that God is spirit. God doesn't have a biological body with chromosomes, reproductive organs. God is spirit beyond biology. And yet God holds the spirituality of all gender and all gender expressions within God's very being. God is not less than masculine, but infinitely more. God is not less than feminine, but infinitely more. The divine encompasses and transcends what we know of and think of as gender culturally. And that divine mystery carries the fullness of all that is nurturing and protective and wise and strong and tender and creative and sustaining. So when we speak of God with feminine metaphors and feminine pronouns, we're not assigning a female body to God, just as we're not assigning a masculine body to God in times when we use masculine language. We are affirming that God is spirit and that God contains the depth of all gendered expressions of life. And when we open ourselves up to that, to a genderful God, something shifts in us. We start to see God's image reflected in all people, across all gender identities and expressions. And that is powerful. We recognize that the image of God is bigger than patriarchy would ever allow. You know, earlier we named how, right, history has erased the feminine divine from our imagination of God. We saw and we talked about how that erasure benefited patriarchy and empire and systems of domination, and the folks who were harmed, women, the vulnerable, they were silenced. And those who experienced God like a mother, pushed to the margins. Those who experienced God in a nurturing way, pushed to the margins. And that harm just carries forward millennia after millennia. And it has shaped the church that has silenced women, societies that devalue the feminine, and spiritual imaginations that can only see maybe not even half, maybe a third of the divine. So the challenge, I think, for us in this question that was asked so beautifully and answered exquisitely is not simply to acknowledge the feminine divine, but to intentionally embrace it, to intentionally call it out into our lives and into our spirituality, because centuries of erasure requires deliberate correction. Centuries of erasure requires deliberate correction. And because healing comes when we balance what has been overemphasized with what has been neglected. And so when we embrace God as genderful, masculinity itself is humbled. How many of y'all would say amen? No? Y'all are happy with the way masculinity is expressed and controlling everything? Right? When we balance this out, it takes up a humble position, and it learns that it's not the whole, but part of the whole. And in that humility, you know what's so powerful? Masculinity can find harmony with femininity. And together they reflect more fully the Spirit of God. So in your everyday normal life, there's some things that you can do to live this out. Very quickly, pray with expansive pronouns. If you're a person who prays, when you pray, try using different pronouns. Go with he one day, go with she one moment, go with they. Right? Notice what rises up in you. Maybe if it's a problem, maybe if there's an issue when you use the word she, your problem is actually that you're a bit misogynistic and sexist. Right? I have to own that. Maybe there's something in your heart that would say, if I call God she, I'm diminishing God. Oh, 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 oh. Where did that come from? Maybe because I was raised in a culture that basically diminished women. Oh, oh. Maybe we need to sit in the discomfort and really question what's the issue. And if saying God is she feels unsettling, don't run from it. Don't judge yourself. Just ask why. Is it rooted in the tradition? Is it rooted in scripture? Is it rooted in culture? Whatever it might be. But sitting with that discomfort can become a holy practice, a sacred space that uncovers where the divine wants to heal us, not judge us, not condemn us, but heal. I want to encourage you to imagine a world where God's primary image was mother instead of king. What would the world look like if for the last 4,000 years, the primary image of the divine had been mother instead of king or warrior? Do you think wars would have been waged the same way? Would women have been silenced? Would the vulnerable have been treated differently? Would we always have the poor among us? See, that type of holy imagination opens our hearts to what still could be possible if we embrace God as genderful. And I want to encourage us to see God's image in all gender expressions. As you move throughout your week, intentionally look for the image of God in diverse expressions of gender, recognizing that gender is a cultural construct. It's performed based upon what culture says it should be. And so you can find the divine image in the tenderness of a mother that culture says has to be tender, or in the courage of a father, or in the courage of a mother, or in the tenderness of a father. The resilience of those who live beyond binary categories, who really do offer us an image of God. Each one carries the divine image. We can pray with feminine biblical images, right? If you're that like Bible, right? If that's your heart and you love it, then I would encourage you, grab mother and hen and wisdom and birth giver and bring those images into your times of meditation and thinking and prayer. Choose one of the scriptures we explore today, right? Sit with it, explore it. Imagine God having you under her wings. Imagine God bending down to feed you and comforting you like a mother. And see what shifts in your heart if you hold that. And when we pray this way, when we imagine this way, when we see each other in this way, we open our hearts to the fullness of God. And what is in the fullness of God? Life and healing and wholeness. We always ask this question, how does talking about this for the last 45 minutes, I know, I'm sorry, I droned on and on. We're going to get to the song and communion. How does this make the world a better place? How does this make me a better person? Because we believe that Crossroads is filled with people who at the very heart of this endeavor to be a church, to be the church, is to say, how do we make the world better? And how do I become better person, better parent, better sibling, better whatever? Well, when we intentionally embrace the feminine divine, we correct centuries of erasure and harm. And as difficult as it might be to hear her used or she used in the way in which we talk about God, it is essential if we're going to participate in the healing of the world. When we do this, masculinity, like I said, is humbled and can learn to live in harmony with femininity. And it really doesn't matter around biological sex. We can stop judging people because we think, oh, they're too feminine or they're too masculine or they're like that in any expression is an expression of the divine. And whether that expression matches what you've been handed by culture as appropriate is worth questioning. And is worth sitting with in love and in peacemaking. And I believe that communities like ours and communities in general that embrace God as genderful become more inclusive, healing, and reflective of the image of God. So maybe that lyric from that song, Counting Blue Cars, isn't wrong after all. Tell me all your thoughts on God, because I'd really like to meet her. And what if meeting God as her isn't about replacing him, but just about expanding our vision of them? What if meeting God as her isn't about replacing him, but expanding our vision of them? What if meeting God as her helps us encounter God in new ways? In a mother who comforts, in the hen who gathers, in the wisdom who guides, and in the Christ who embodies love beyond boundaries. And so the invitation as we come to the table today is very simple. Open your heart to the fullness of God. See the image of God in every gender expression. Make space for those who need to encounter God beyond the confines of patriarchy, beyond the confines of what culture has said is acceptable. And let that divine feminine draw you into the deeper mystery of God, who is more than we could ever imagine. And so for our closing song today, we're going to sing a new song called Bigger Than. And as we come to the table of communion, we're reminded in this song, and we're reminded in these elements, in these metaphors, that the divine mystery is experienced right here in this place, in this moment, in both tender and powerful ways. And the bread and the cup, right? They remind us, yes, of Christ's body and blood, for sure. But they also remind us that the divine cannot be reduced to one image. There's two images here, body and blood, right? That the divine image can't be reduced to one category or one pronoun. And so we close with this song, Bigger Than, because it's fitting. And it reminds us that God is mystery to be explored and experienced, not a formula to be solved or categorically defined and confined. The God who is spirit, the God who is both masculine and feminine and beyond those labels, the God who gave us birth, the God who gathers us under her wings is always bigger than our language, always bigger than our imaginations, always bigger than our theologies, always bigger than our categories. And so, as we sing, may this be our prayer, that our hearts stay open, that our imaginations stay wide, that our lives reflect the fullness of the God who is bigger than we can ever define. And on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he gathered all of his friends at a table, and he gave them some bread, and he gave them some wine, and he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And in that moment, he didn't give them a doctrine to memorize. He didn't give them a formula to defend. He gave them an experience to embody. And that's what we do. As we eat this bread and drink this juice, we embody that reminder that God is bigger than, not contained in our categories. But somehow this mystery comes close to us. Somehow this mystery is experienced with us. And so bread and cup in this moment becomes a sign that God is present in all of who we are. Male, female, non-binary, and beyond. So the table tells us that God's love is genderful. God's love is expansive. God's love makes space for every one of us to be all of us and for all of us to be nourished and made whole. So as we drink together and as we eat together, we remember God is spirit. God is our mother and father and parent. God is our wisdom and our word. That God is bigger than the names and images that we have been given and that we will give others and we will receive from others because we recognize that. And so we sing this song because, again, the divine is not something to deduce or reduce or define, but someone we encounter, a mystery to be explored and an experience that keeps expanding over and over and over again. A love that will not be bound, a love that will conquer all. So the opening lyrics of this song says, "Love is able to provide. Love is faithful in perfect time. This goodness overwhelms. I am held." That's the divine feminine, holding, providing, loving. And so at your tables are the cup and the juice. If you're on the seats, you're invited to the tables here. If you're in the back, there's tables there. And we come to the table, we receive every person, the bread and the cup. Doesn't matter your belief system, doesn't matter whether this is your first time or your last time here. These symbols represent love, and a love that nourishes us. And let's lift our voices together and learn this song that reminds us that divine love is bigger than our categories, bigger than our fears, our dreams. The body of Christ broken for you, the blood of Christ shed for you.